Sometimes, the smallest act of kindness, just 3 simple words, can bring a silent child back to life and heal a broken family forever. Daniel Roth stepped out of his black SUV and looked up at the sky. It was overcast, with a light wind blowing, carrying the scent of rain and dust. He opened the back door and helped his 6-year-old son Caleb out of the car. The little boy didn't say a word, didn't smile, didn't even look up at his father. He simply took Daniel's hand, small fingers curling around it weakly, and walked beside him without a sound. The diner looked like something from an old movie. Red booths, neon signs, and a chalkboard menu that listed pancakes and burgers. In messy handwriting. Daniel had found it by accident while driving through a small town about 2 hours from the city. It was quiet, out of the way, and most importantly, no one there knew who he was. He was Daniel Roth, founder and CEO of one of the world's biggest tech companies. He had made his first million before he turned 30, was on magazine covers before he hit 40, and had once given a TED Talk that went viral. But none of that mattered anymore. Not the money, not the fame, not the admiration of people around. The world. Because 1 year ago, everything had shattered. Daniel had lost his wife Hannah in a car crash. 1 minute she was picking up groceries, and the next she was gone. And since that day, Caleb had not spoken a single word. It wasn't just sadness. It was like the boy had turned off completely. His bright laughter, his endless questions, his silly jokes, all of it had vanished. Doctors called it selective mutism triggered by trauma. Therapists tried different techniques. Specialists were flown in. And Daniel spent hundreds of thousands of dollars hoping for a breakthrough, but nothing worked. The silence remained. And so here they were, sitting in a booth near the window where the morning light fell gently on Caleb's pale face. The waitress walked over with a notepad and a bright smile. "Good morning, gentlemen," she said. "My name's Ellie. Can I start you off with something warm? Hot chocolate for the little guy?" Caleb stared at the table. Daniel nodded. "Yes, please. And a black coffee for me." Ellie looked at Caleb and smiled kindly. "Tough morning." "Huh, you look like a very serious young man. Better not mess up your order, Sir Serious." Still no reaction. Ellie paused. Then she crouched a little, bringing herself to Caleb's eye level. Her voice softened. "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I didn't mean to tease. I just like to make people smile." Daniel watched her carefully. She didn't seem annoyed or impatient. She didn't try to force Caleb to talk or ask what was wrong. With him, she simply stood up, gave them a little wink, and walked away. For some reason, that small moment stuck with him. People often reacted strangely to Caleb's silence. Some pitied him, some felt awkward. Others tried to fix him, with jokes or questions. But Ellie, she just treated him like a person, not a patient, not a project. It's just a child. Daniel sipped his coffee and looked out the window. Trees swayed gently in the wind, and the sky turned a little grayer. He wondered how much longer. He could keep doing this, pretending things might go back to normal. Every morning he hoped Caleb would speak. Every night he went to bed with that hope crushed again. It was like watching your child disappear a little more each day and being powerless to stop it. When the food came, Ellie placed a small cup of hot chocolate in front of Caleb with whipped cream and 2 marshmallows floating on top. 1 for each smile I'm hoping to get, she said cheerfully. Caleb looked at the drink. Then, very slowly, he picked it up with both hands and took a small sip. He didn't smile, but he didn't pull away either. "That's a good start," Ellie whispered, then turned to Daniel. "Let me know if you need anything else." After breakfast, Daniel paid the bill, left a generous tip, and took Caleb back to the car. But something in his chest felt different, the tiny shift. Like a breeze through a window that had been shut for too long. The next weekend. Without really thinking about it, he drove back to the same diner. Ellie greeted them with the same cheerful smile. "Well, if it isn't Sir Serious and his dad, I saved your booth." Again, no words from Caleb, but he didn't resist sitting down this time. He looked around the diner slowly, noticing the comic strip tacked to the bulletin board. The little bell above the kitchen door. The jars of candy behind the counter. Ellie brought him hot chocolate without asking, and so it became a habit. Every Saturday morning, Daniel and Caleb drove 2 hours to the little diner. Sometimes they talked in the car. Well, Daniel talked. He told Caleb stories about when he was a kid, about the time he broke his arm falling off a tree, about how scared he was to start his first company, about how much he loved Caleb's mother and how funny she was when she danced in the kitchen. Caleb never said a word, but he listened. At the diner, Ellie always had something new, a joke written on a napkin, a funny face drawn with syrup on pancakes, a straw twisted into a silly shape. She never asked Caleb to talk, never made a big deal about his silence. She just showed up with warmth and patience. One morning, Daniel asked her, "Do you have kids?" "No," Ellie said, sliding into the booth across from him while Caleb quietly played with his spoon. "But I had a little brother once. His name was Jamie. He was 5 years younger than me." "What happened to him?" Daniel asked. Gently, Ellie paused. Her smile faded just a little. "He stopped talking after our mom left. Just one day silence. He wouldn't speak, wouldn't even cry. Da. People thought he was just stubborn or slow. Da. But he wasn't. He was hurting." Daniel leaned forward. "Did he ever start speaking again?" "No," she said quietly. "He passed away from an illness a few years later. But I always remembered how people treated him. Like he was broken. But he wasn't. He was just scared. Just stuck." Daniel looked at Caleb. The boy was staring at the ketchup bottle, lost in thought. "I never forgot how to talk to kids like him," Ellie added softly. "You don't have to pull them out. Just have to sit quietly with them until they come back." Daniel didn't say anything. His throat felt tight. He looked at Caleb and thought of all the things he'd tried, all the money spent. The flights to New York, the video calls with specialists, and here, in a small-town diner, a woman with no degree or title was saying the most honest thing he'd ever heard. That night, Daniel lay awake in his bed, watching the ceiling. The house was silent, except for the soft hum of the heater. He got up, walked down the hall, and peeked into Caleb's room. The boy was asleep, curled up under the blanket with his stuffed elephant beside him, the one Anne had given him. Daniel sat on the edge of the bed and brushed his son's hair gently. "I miss her too, buddy," he whispered. "I miss her." Every single day. There was no reply. But Caleb turned slightly in his sleep and placed one small hand over Daniel's, and for the first time in many months, Daniel allowed himself to cry. Not in secret, not in shame, but openly, sitting there in the quiet room. With tears rolling down his face, he cried because he missed Hannah. He cried because he didn't know how to help his son. He cried because he finally understood that no amount of money could fix grief, and somewhere deep inside that pain, something softened. A wall began to crack. The next morning, Daniel made pancakes. He wasn't very good at it. They came out uneven and slightly burned, but when he placed one on Caleb's plate, the boy picked up his fork and took a bite. Daniel smiled. "Not as good as Ellie's, huh?" Caleb looked at him for a long moment. His eyes said more than any words could. Daniel knew the road ahead would be long. There was no magic cure, but for the first time, he felt like they weren't lost. They were just slowly, carefully finding their way back. And it had all started with a simple moment at a small-town diner. A kind waitress, a gentle apology, a silent boy, and a father who refused to give up. The next few weeks passed in quiet repetition. Every Saturday morning, Daniel and Caleb would drive to the small diner. It had become their unspoken tradition. Daniel didn't ask if Caleb wanted to go, and Caleb never resisted. He just picked up his small backpack, which always carried a single crayon and a tiny notepad, and followed his father to the car. The drive was usually silent. Sometimes Daniel would talk about the weather, or tell Caleb what he'd read in the news, or mention something funny he saw in a movie. Caleb never responded, but Daniel noticed how his son's eyes followed the trees passing by or stared at clouds that looked like animals. It wasn't just blank silence anymore. It was the silence of someone who was listening. At the diner, Ellie was always there, ready with her warm smile and easy charm. She welcomed them like they were old friends, not customers. Every time, She treated Caleb as if his silence didn't bother her at all. If anything, she seemed to understand it better than anyone else. "Good morning. My favorite gentleman duo," she'd say, placing two menus down even though they always ordered the same thing. Hot chocolate for Caleb, coffee for Daniel, and pancakes for both. "I have something new today. You ready?" She pulled out a napkin with a stick figure drawing, a tiny knight with a spoon as a sword, fighting a dragon made of bacon. "I call him Sir Breakfast," she grinned. Caleb didn't laugh or smile, but his eyes lingered on the drawing for a few extra seconds. He reached for his hot chocolate and took a slow sip. It was something, a flicker of connection, a moment of presence. Daniel noticed every little thing now, a longer glance, a blink of curiosity, a moment when Caleb's fingers traced a doodle Ellie left near his plate. Ellie was different from other people. She never made a big deal about what Caleb didn't do. She didn't push him to talk. She didn't try to fix him. She simply gave him space to exist. She joked softly, made silly drawings, and always crouched to his level when she spoke. Was gentle and respectful, never loud or dramatic. Daniel began to see that she wasn't doing this for attention or praise. She wasn't trying to be a hero. She was just being kind. Real kindness, the quiet kind that didn't ask for anything in return. One afternoon, as the diner started to empty out, Ellie refilled Daniel's coffee and sat down across from him. "Do you ever wonder," she said, "what he's thinking?" "All the time," Daniel replied. "Every minute, I'd give anything to know." Ellie nodded slowly. "I used to sit with my brother like this, Jamie. He'd line up toy soldiers on the table and move them without a sound. I used to think he was in another world, somewhere no one else could reach." Daniel sipped his coffee. "How did you handle it?" "I stopped trying to pull him out," she said. "I started going in instead. I'd play his games. I'd sit with him in silence. Some days, that silence was our conversation." Daniel looked at Caleb, who was now gently stacking the syrup packets like building blocks. "You never gave up on him, no?" Ellie whispered. "I wish I could have done more. But he didn't have someone like you. Jamie was in foster care by the time he was 9. I was too young to keep him." There was a pause. Her voice didn't shake, but her eyes gave her pain away. Daniel leaned forward. "I'm sorry." Ellie smiled. "It's okay. I think helping." "Caleb, it helps me too." Over the next few visits, Ellie started leaving little surprises for Caleb. Sometimes it was a joke written in block letters. "What do you call a bear with no teeth?" Underneath the answer, a gummy bear. Other times, it was a simple maze drawn on his placemat, or a cartoon elephant that looked a bit like the stuffed one he always carried. Daniel watched closely every time. He noticed how Caleb's fingers followed the lines of the maze, how he quietly traced the elephant's ears, how he even started sliding the napkins closer to him as if collecting them. Then one day, something different happened. As Ellie walked by, she dropped her pen by accident. It rolled off her tray and landed near Caleb's foot. Without looking up, he bent down, picked it up, and handed it back to her. Ellie paused, stunned for just a moment. Then she took it gently and whispered, "Thank you, Captain Quiet." Daniel held his breath. It was such a small action, a simple gesture. But it was the first time Caleb had interacted with anyone in months. No one asked him to, no one forced him. He just did it. That evening, back at home, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not the kind of hope he used to fake for therapists or school meetings, but a soft, real kind of hope that settled in his chest like warm light. He knew it would be a slow journey, but he also knew something was changing. And it was all because of one person who had shown his son kindness when the rest of the world had moved on. A few days later, Daniel found a stack of napkins in Caleb's backpack. All of Ellie's drawings, riddles, and tiny cartoon characters were neatly folded inside. Daniel flipped through them slowly, smiling at each silly sketch. Caleb hadn't thrown them away, hadn't ignored them. He'd kept them, every single one. The next Saturday, as they sat down at their usual booth, Ellie looked at Caleb with a twinkle in her eye. "I brought something special today," she said. "You ready?" She pulled out a coloring page, a simple drawing of a spaceship with stars around it, and laid it down with 3 crayons. Red, blue, and green. This is the SS Pancake, Captain Caleb's official spaceship. It's missing some colors, though. Think you could help me out? Caleb stared at the page. He didn't move. But after a few seconds, he picked up the blue crayon and slowly began to color the top of the ship. Ellie didn't say a word. Just sat back, smiled, and looked at Daniel. Their eyes met, and in that moment, neither of them needed to say anything. It was working, not through therapy, not through pressure, but through kindness, consistency, and patience. Later that day, as they were leaving, Ellie knelt beside Caleb and said, "You're doing a great job, Captain. We'll finish the mission next time." Caleb didn't speak. But for the first time, he looked her directly in the eyes. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. His mind kept replaying the small moments. The crayon in Caleb's hand, the look he gave Ellie, the way he had responded to her voice. He thought about how far they had come, and he realized something important. He was starting to feel like a father again. For months after Hannah's death, Daniel had been drowning in guilt. He'd been working late that night, and she was driving alone. He'd been the one to say, "Don't worry, I'll pick up Caleb tomorrow," because he had a meeting, and then she was gone. For a long time, Daniel believed Caleb had gone silent because of her death. But now he was beginning to understand something deeper. Maybe it wasn't just grief. Maybe Caleb had shut down because he had felt alone. Was rushing to fix him when all he needed was someone to just be there. The next morning, Daniel sat beside Caleb on the couch. They watched cartoons together, and Daniel didn't try to talk. He didn't ask questions, just stayed with him. After a while, Caleb reached over and handed Daniel one of Ellie's drawings, the spaceship. Daniel smiled. "You want to finish this together?" Caleb gave a tiny nod, and so, with a quiet heart, Daniel picked up the red crayon, and father and son began to color side by side. It was still silence. But this time, it wasn't empty. It was shared. It was healing. It was love. And it was all made possible by a kind waitress who didn't try to fix anything. She just noticed, cared, and stayed. Days turned into weeks, and the small diner continued to be their Saturday ritual. It was no longer just a quiet escape for Daniel and his son. It had become the only place where Caleb seemed a little less lost. The silence still followed them, but something had changed. Silence wasn't as heavy anymore. It was softer. There was more understanding in it, a little more life. Every time they arrived at the diner, Ellie greeted them with her usual joy. She never stopped calling Caleb Captain. She never forgot to bring him his favorite hot chocolate with exactly 2 marshmallows on top. Caleb still hadn't spoken, but Daniel could tell that Ellie's presence made a difference. Caleb would look at her when she talked. He would accept her little drawings and color them carefully. Even handed her back a crayon once when she dropped it. It was a small gesture, but to Daniel, it was like seeing his son peek out from behind. A locked door one Saturday morning, it was raining hard. The streets were slick and gray, and Daniel almost thought about skipping their weekly visit. But when he asked Caleb if he wanted to go, the boy quietly zipped up his jacket and stood by the door, waiting. That was all Daniel needed to see. They drove through the storm, windshield wipers swinging back and forth, and reached the diner just after 10 a.m. inside. The diner was warm, glowing with yellow lights and the smell of coffee and pancakes. It was busier than usual, but Ellie saw them the moment they entered. She waved them over to their usual booth, already set with napkins, menus, and a small plastic astronaut figurine sitting in the middle of the table. "Today," she announced. With a playful grin, Captain Caleb is going to the moon. Caleb looked at the figurine. He reached out and touched it with one finger, then slowly pulled it toward him. Daniel smiled to himself. The child who used to avoid eye contact and keep his hands in his lap was now gently playing with a toy in public. Progress didn't always look loud. Sometimes it was silent, slow and steady. As they settled in, Ellie handed Caleb a folded napkin. When he opened it, he found a small drawing of a rocket ship, stars all around it, and a funny alien waving from a crater. At the bottom, were the words, "Mission, draw your own planet." Daniel watched as Caleb pulled a crayon from his backpack and quietly began to sketch something next to Ellie's drawing. Planet with rings, then a tiny house on the surface. There are two stick figures standing outside the house, one big, one small. Daniel felt something swell in his chest. He didn't ask what the drawing meant. He didn't need to. He knew. Ellie returned a moment later and leaned over. "Wow," she said softly, looking at the drawing. "That's amazing, Captain. You're really good at this." Caleb didn't respond. But for the first time, he slid the drawing across the table, offering it to her. Ellie blinked, clearly touched. She gently picked it up and looked at Daniel. "I'm framing this," she said. Daniel felt his throat tighten. He hadn't seen Caleb offer anything to anyone in almost a year. It wasn't just a drawing, it was a message. It was connection, it was trust. That night after they returned home, Daniel made mac and cheese for dinner. It was simple. Something Hannah used to make for Caleb when he was small. They sat at the table eating quietly. Then Daniel said, "You did a great job on your drawing today." Caleb looked up from his plate. His face was calm, thoughtful. "You like Ellie, don't you?" Daniel asked gently. Caleb didn't nod. He didn't shake his head, but his eyes said everything. That week, something shifted even more. At bedtime, instead of hiding under his blanket like usual, Caleb sat on his bed with his drawing pad. He sketched in silence, the tip of his tongue poking out as he focused. Daniel sat beside him, quietly watching. Then, slowly, Caleb turned the pad around. On the page was another drawing, a tiny diner, two stick figures in a booth, and a smiling woman with curly hair serving them. Daniel smiled. "That's us?" Caleb nodded. It was the first time he had acknowledged something so directly. Daniel didn't press him. He just said, "I love it." He felt tears prick the corners of his eyes, but he held them back. Not because he was ashamed, but because he didn't want to break the moment. Later that night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in his mind. He thought of Hannah, how much she would have loved to see Caleb drawing again, how she would have hugged Ellie for bringing light back into their lives. And he thought of Ellie's words. Weeks ago, you don't have to pull them out. You just have to sit with them until they come back. Daniel had spent months trying to pull Caleb out. Now he was learning how to just sit beside him. The following Saturday, the rain had cleared and the sky was blue again. When they walked into the diner, Ellie was waiting with a wide grin. "I have a surprise today," she said. "But only if Captain Caleb is ready for his first official mission." She handed him a small envelope with his name on it. Inside was a card with the words, "Diner Space Club, official member." Caleb held it gently. His fingers rubbed the edge of the card like he was checking if it was real. Ellie leaned down. "Every space captain needs a badge. You're part of the crew now." Caleb didn't speak, but his eyes stayed locked on hers longer than usual. Daniel saw something flicker in them, something that looked a lot like gratitude. They had breakfast. As usual, Caleb colored a new planet. Ellie drew an alien family. And Daniel watched the exchange like it was the most important event in the world. Then something happened that stopped everything. As Ellie cleared their plates, she knocked over a cup of water, spilled quickly across the table, running toward Caleb's coloring page. "Oh no," she gasped, grabbing napkins. "I'm so sorry, Captain. I didn't mean to ruin your planet." Caleb pulled the page away quickly. A few drops had hit the corner, but most of the drawing was safe. Ellie crouched beside him, her voice apologetic but calm. I really messed that up, didn't I?" "I'm sorry, Caleb. I didn't mean to hurt your drawing." She reached for more napkins and dabbed at the table. Then, without warning, a voice broke the air. "It's okay." Everything froze. Daniel's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. Ellie's hands froze on the napkin. The diner, once filled with soft noise, suddenly felt silent. They both looked at Caleb. His face was pink, his eyes focused on Ellie. His lips had moved. He had spoken. Ellie blinked, stunned. Then her smile returned, trembling a little. You talked," she whispered. Caleb looked down quickly. Shy now, but it was too late. The moment had happened. He had spoken, not forced, not pushed. Just ... naturally. Daniel didn't know what to do. He felt like standing up and cheering, crying, laughing all at once. But he stayed calm. He didn't want to scare Caleb back into silence. Instead, he reached over and placed his hand on his son's. Just a soft squeeze. Caleb looked at him, and for the first time in nearly a year, they shared a true, honest connection, word to word. Heart to heart, Ellie wiped her eyes and laughed. "You just made my whole year, Captain." Caleb didn't reply, but he didn't pull away. That was enough. The rest of breakfast felt different. The air had changed. The silence wasn't heavy. Anymore, it was filled with meaning, with understanding. Daniel could barely eat. His mind was spinning, his heart full. On the drive home, Daniel didn't speak much. He didn't want to overwhelm Caleb. But just as they turned onto their street, Caleb looked out the window and whispered, "I like her." Daniel almost hit the brakes. He turned to look at his son. But Caleb was staring at the trees, a quiet smile on his face. Daniel didn't push it. He just smiled and replied, "Me too." That night, Daniel sat on the edge of his bed and whispered, a thank you to the quiet air around him. He wasn't a religious man, but at that moment, he believed in something bigger than himself. Kindness, patience, the invisible hands that guide people back to each other. He knew the journey wasn't over. Caleb wouldn't suddenly become the loud, playful boy he used to be. Healing wasn't instant. But a door had opened. It was all because someone noticed. Someone cared. A waitress with a simple heart. A boy with a silent world. And a father who never gave up. It was the smallest voice that made the loudest impact. And the most powerful moment came not with a breakthrough in therapy, but with 3 quiet words. It's okay. The world had not changed overnight, but something inside it had. Since that rainy morning at the diner, Daniel had been living in a quiet state of wonder. He kept playing that moment in his head, Caleb, sitting there with his small hands pressed. On the table, his voice soft but clear, saying, "It's okay." Those 2 words had cracked open a door that had been locked for almost a year. After that day, Daniel didn't try to force anything. He didn't start asking Caleb 100 questions or make a big celebration. He knew that might scare him. Instead, he kept everything calm and gentle, just like Ellie had always done. He didn't talk too much. He didn't ask too much. He just let the silence stay where it needed to, and waited for the words to come when they wanted, and they did. Slowly the next Saturday. When they walked into the diner, Ellie looked up from behind the counter and waved as usual. "Captain." "Caleb," she said in her cheerful voice, "I missed you." Caleb looked at her, hesitated for just a second, then gave a small smile. It wasn't wide, but it was real. Then he walked straight to their usual booth, climbed in, and pulled out his crayons. Daniel sat across from him, trying not to cry again. Every little action felt huge now. Every look, every smile, every response from his son felt like a miracle. He'd lived with silence for so long that now even a quiet smile felt like thunder. Ellie walked over with their drinks, hot chocolate with 2 marshmallows for the captain. She said, setting the mug down in front of Caleb and coffee, "For the general?" Daniel laughed softly. "General? Well, someone has to steer the ship when the captain's asleep," she joked. Caleb looked at the hot chocolate, then at her. Then he said something so softly, Daniel almost didn't hear it. "Thank you." Ellie froze, her eyes wide, and then slowly bent down beside him. "You're very welcome, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice shaky. For the next hour, the 3 of them sat there talking. Not a full conversation, but something close. Ellie kept things light, telling silly stories, making jokes about pancakes that walked off the plate, and asking Caleb for help designing a space menu for alien diners. Caleb didn't always respond, but when he did, his answers were quiet and short and beautiful. Later that week, something unusual happened. Daniel got a call from Caleb's school. The counselor had noticed changes, small but important ones. Caleb had nodded in class, drawn pictures during art, and even whispered a word or 2 to his teacher. No full sentences, no big outbursts, but enough to show he was waking up again. Daniel thanked them and hung up, then sat in the kitchen staring at the phone. He realized how little he'd thought about school lately. He'd been so focused on helping Caleb survive that he forgot. There was still a life waiting for his son to return to. That night, he made spaghetti just like Hannah used to. Caleb sat at the table with him, quietly twirling his fork. Daniel looked across at him and smiled. "Did you draw anything at school today?" Caleb nodded. "What was it?" Caleb looked up. "A dragon," he whispered. Daniel laughed gently. "Was it a nice dragon?" "Sleepy one," Caleb said. It was the most words Caleb had spoken to him since Hannah died. Daniel didn't say much after that. He didn't want to break the moment. He just kept eating beside his son, a quiet joy warming him from the inside. The next Saturday, Daniel and Caleb arrived at the diner early. Ellie wasn't at their usual booth yet, so they waited quietly. Caleb had brought something new in his backpack of folded paper, carefully held. Daniel didn't ask what it was. When Ellie finally walked out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, she saw them and smiled wide. "There you are. I thought maybe you'd taken the rocket to Mars without me." Caleb stood up, reached into his bag, and walked over to her. Without a word, he handed her the folded paper. Ellie looked surprised. "For me?" Caleb nodded. She unfolded it slowly. Inside was a drawing of a diner floating in space, with a rocket ship parked outside and 3 stick figures inside one with curly hair, one tall, one small. She covered her mouth with her hand, trying not to cry. "This is the best thing anyone has ever given me," she whispered. Daniel watched, overwhelmed with emotion. He had never seen Caleb give someone a gift like that before. This wasn't just a drawing. It was a piece of his heart. As they sat down again, Ellie carefully placed the drawing behind the counter, taping it to the wall where everyone could see. She wrote under it in block letters, "Captain Caleb's Space Diner, official artwork." The weeks passed. More changes began to happen. Caleb started talking more at home. Not all the time, and not loudly, but enough that the house no longer felt silent. He would ask for his favorite cup. He would hum when playing with his toys. Sometimes he would even ask Daniel questions, like, "Can we go to the lake?" Or, "Do you think stars are hot?" Daniel answered every question with patience, never rushing, never interrupting. He knew these moments were fragile. He knew one wrong step could push Caleb back into silence. So he treated each word like gold. At the diner, Ellie and Caleb had developed a bond that no one else could match. She never talked to him like a baby, never treated him like a problem. She treated him like a boy with imagination, with a mind full of stars and dragons and quiet wisdom. One day, as they were finishing breakfast, Ellie sat beside Caleb and said, "I want to tell you something, Captain." Caleb looked at her, his eyes curious. "I used to have a little brother," she said softly. "His name was Jamie. He didn't talk much either for a long time." Caleb tilted his head. "He was really smart," she continued. "He liked space and drawing, too. Not everyone understood him. They thought he was weird or broken." Daniel listened quietly. He hadn't heard Ellie talk about Jamie in detail before. "One day Jamie told me he wished people would stop trying to change him," Ellie said. "He just wanted someone to sit with him. It's like you and your dad do." Caleb didn't say anything, but his eyes stayed on her, full of focus. "I think he would have liked you a lot," Ellie finished. There was silence. Then after a long pause, Caleb reached across the table and touched her hand. Ellie blinked, then gave the smallest, saddest smile. "Thank you, sweetheart," she whispered. That night, Daniel and Caleb sat in the backyard watching the stars. They lay on a blanket, the cool air brushing their faces. Daniel pointed at the constellations, naming the ones he remembered from childhood. "Do you think Mom can see us from the stars?" Caleb asked quietly. Daniel turned to him, surprised by the question. He swallowed hard, then nodded. "I do," he said, "and I think she's really proud of you." Caleb was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I miss her." Daniel nodded, tears in his eyes. "Me too." It was the first time Caleb had spoken about Hannah since she died. And Daniel felt something shift again, this time deeper. His son wasn't just talking now. He was feeling. He was opening up days past, and their lives began to grow fuller. Caleb's teachers sent home notes saying he was speaking softly in class, drew more, played more, even laughed now and then, not loudly, not all the time, but enough to fill the house with something that had been missing for too long. Joy, Ellie, remained part of their lives, not just at the diner, but beyond. Daniel had invited her to the park once, when he and Caleb went for a walk, and she came with hot chocolate and cookies. They laughed together, watched Caleb try to build a rocket from sticks and leaves, and shared stories from their pasts. Daniel had never felt this kind of peace before. It wasn't the fast, exciting life he had known when building his tech company. It wasn't awards, applause, or boardrooms. It was quiet, it was simple, and it was everything. He began to think about how many children like Caleb were out there. Quiet, misunderstood, surrounded by people who didn't know how to listen. And how many Ellies were out there, two kind souls with no fancy degrees, but hearts big enough to change lives? He started writing something. At first just notes, then ideas, then a plan. He didn't tell anyone about it yet. Not even Ellie. But he knew that what she had done for his son, what she had done for him. He didn't just serve pancakes. And she didn't just serve pancakes and coffee. She served hope one morning. Daniel watched Caleb draw a picture of their family. It had 3 people in it himself, Daniel and Ellie. There was a dog too, even though they didn't own one. "Who's this?" Daniel asked, pointing to the dog. "Our space dog," Caleb said with a grin. Daniel laughed. "Of course." She looked at the picture again, and he felt something settle inside him. Something calm, something good. The world hadn't been fair to them. It had taken Hannah too soon. It had left Caleb in silence. But now, it was giving them something else. Healing. And it had all started with a waitress who didn't ask questions. Didn't judge, didn't force anything. She just noticed a quiet boy and offered him something new. One else had patience, understanding, kindness. And those 3 things had done more than any expert in the world. They had helped a child find his voice again. After many months of quiet progress and small miracles, Daniel could feel that a new chapter was beginning for his family. Caleb's silence was no longer a wall. It had become a bridge away for him to connect with the world bit by bit. Daniel also knew healing was not a straight path. There would be days when Caleb would retreat, days when the weight of loss and sadness would feel too heavy. Yet hope had found its way in, like a tiny light growing brighter. One early morning, Daniel sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring at his laptop. For weeks now, he had been working on an idea that had been growing inside him. The story of Caleb, Ellie, and their journey had inspired him deeply. He wanted to create something bigger, a way to help other children like Caleb and families like his own. A way to spread the kindness Ellie had shown. Not just in words, but in actions. He began typing slowly, carefully, remembering every detail. How Ellie had never judged Caleb. How she had patiently sat beside him. How she had quietly said, "It's okay." Those 3 words had changed everything. As the sun rose, Daniel wrote about patience, about understanding, about the power of kindness that requires no grand gestures, only presence. He wrote about the little diner where miracles happened over coffee and pancakes. It's about how a small act of caring could open the door to a silent world and invite a child back inside. While Daniel worked, Caleb was in his room, drawing again. His drawings had become a way to express feelings he could not yet say out loud. Sometimes Daniel would peek in and see the smile on Caleb's face as he colored carefully, adding details to his imaginary world: spaceships, friendly aliens, planets filled with strange creatures and colors. One afternoon, Daniel suggested they visit the park, and to his surprise, Caleb agreed. It was the first time Caleb had asked to go out with his father and Ellie without hesitation. The sun was warm, birds sang in the trees, and children laughed as they played nearby. Caleb carried a small backpack filled with crayons and paper. He sat on the grass with Ellie and began to draw. Daniel watched as Ellie helped him choose colors, encouraging him gently but never pushing. A little girl ran over and asked Caleb what he was drawing. Caleb looked up shyly and said, "A rocket." "Ship," the girl smiled. "Can I draw with you?" Caleb nodded slowly. Daniel smiled, feeling a rush of happiness. The boy who once hid behind silence was now sharing space. even with strangers. As the afternoon went on, Daniel noticed parents nearby watching Caleb and Ellie. Some looked curious. Others looked hopeful. Daniel realized that the story they were living was becoming a story others wanted to hear. A story of hope, patience, and healing. When they returned home, Daniel showed Caleb the first draft of his writing. He read aloud the words about kindness and waiting with someone instead of pushing them to speak. Caleb listened quietly, then looked at his father and said softly, "Good." It was the simplest praise, but it meant the world. Days later, Daniel contacted a small publishing company to share his manuscript. He wanted this story to reach people beyond their little town. He hoped it would inspire others, parents, teachers, waitresses, strangers to understand the power of quiet kindness. Meanwhile, Caleb's voice continued to grow. He began to say more words at home, not complete sentences yet, but words like thank you, please, and even love. Yes. Each word was precious, a step on a long road. One evening, as Daniel tucked Caleb into bed, Caleb said something new. "Dad," he whispered, "I'm happy." Ah! Daniel's heart soared. "Me too, Caleb. Me too." School teachers noticed too. Caleb raised his hand during lessons, sometimes answering questions in a soft voice. He even made a friend, a boy named Liam, who shared his love of drawing and space. Daniel was careful not to expect too much too soon, but he allowed himself to feel proud. Ellie remained a steady part of their lives. It's not just a waitress at the diner, but a friend who celebrated every small victory with them. When Daniel invited her to dinner one evening, she arrived with cookies and a big smile. "I never thought a job waiting tables could be so important," Daniel said one night as they sat together. Ellie shrugged. Sometimes the smallest kindness is the biggest gift. One day, Daniel was invited to speak at a local community center about his experience. He shared how losing Hannah had broken their family, how Caleb's silence had crushed him, and how the simple kindness of a waitress had helped his son find his voice again. He told the audience about patience, about sitting with someone instead of pulling them out, about the quiet power of understanding. People listened with tears and smiles. Some told him they had children who struggled. Others said they had felt invisible in their own lives. Daniel realized the story was bigger than his family. It was about the human need to be seen and heard, no matter how quietly. Caleb sat nearby during the talk, drawing in his notebook. When Daniel finished, the audience applauded softly, and Caleb looked up and smiled. Later that night, Daniel sat with Caleb and Ellie, talking about the future. Caleb's voice was stronger now, his laughter more frequent. Daniel saw hope shining. In his son's eyes, he knew the journey wasn't over. There would be challenges ahead. But with kindness, patience, and love, anything was possible. The little diner remained their sanctuary, a place where silence turned into words, and where a simple "it's okay" could change a life forever.